There once was a little boy who decided that he wanted to meet God. So, he packed his suitcase with his Twinkies and a six-pack of root beer, and he set off to meet God. He got about 3 blocks away from his house, and he came to a park. And he saw an old woman sitting on a bench in the park, and so he stopped. And he got up on the bench and sat down, and after a few minutes, he realized he was getting thirsty, so he opened his little suitcase and got out his little root beer and started to drink, and he looked at the woman, and he thought she looked a little hungry. So he reached in his suitcase and pulled out a Twinkie and handed it to the old lady. And she gladly accepted it. She received it and ate it, and she just smiled at him so brightly, a big smile. And he was delighted to have her smile at him. And he loved her smile so much that he wanted to see it again. So he pulled out another root beer, and he handed it to her, and she gladly received it and drank it and smiled, that big smile. And they sat there for many hours, not saying a word, just eating Twinkies and drinking root beer. And so after a little while, the little boy realized it was probably time for him to head home, and so he packed up his little suitcase and got down off the bench and started walking away. And down a few feet, and he stopped and turned around, and he ran back and gave the old lady the biggest hug. And she just smiled her big smile, and he was thrilled and delighted. And so when he got home, he walked in the door, and he was just jubilant, and his mom said, "Well, where were you all day?" He said, "I had lunch in the park with God." And before she could say anything, and you know what? She has the most beautiful smile. And so across town, the old woman went home, and her son greeted her, and she had the most peaceful look on her face. And he said, "Mom, where have you been?" And she said, "I ate Twinkies with God in the park today." And you know what? He was a little younger than I thought he would be. So it's a sweet story, touching, moving, humorous. And really, in a way, it's a parable. It's a parable. You know, Jesus taught very often in these stories that seem to have a very clear surface message. And yet, beneath the surface, there's great depth. There's great spiritual teaching and truth if we look beneath the surface of the story. And so as I looked at that story this week, I thought about that little boy and his decision that he was going to meet God. He knew it would be a journey, and so he packed his goodies, set off on his journey undeterred. And I think that really, you know, since the dawning of human consciousness, if we go back, humankind has been curious about God or the universe or life energy or whatever it is that we sense all around us. That we sense at some level there is something bigger than we are. Something in which we do live and move and have our being. And there are stories in the Bible of people trying to tell their own experience of God, trying to explain God. You know, we look at the world around us. We look at why things happen, and we make up stories about why it happened, what's going on. We want to understand. And so the stories are about God as a creator God, or God as a healer God, or God as a Savior God. Different people's experiences of God. And so we have poems and songs and books and all sorts of expressions of people's experience of God. And throughout the years, the centuries, our idea of God has evolved. Well, at least some of us have evolved our ideas of God. I think most people in this room have evolved our ideas about God because we look at new discoveries, science, that shows certain things were not the way we always thought they were, and so our ideas about God begin to evolve. But I think more than just wanting to know about God, we want to know what our relationship is to this thing that we call God. Whatever it is we call it. We want to know how we fit in the picture. And so that's part of our discovery as well. And that truly was the primary purpose initially for religion. In fact, the word religion comes from the Latin, which means to bind together. So the purpose of religion really was to help us, people, have an experience of God. But as we know, religion kind of has gotten into other things very often. Money, power, politics. And so the story, getting back to the story, is about, I think, our innate desire to know God and to know our relationship to God, to meet God, to find God, to have a relationship with whatever that is. And so the little boy is the example of that consciousness, I think, that opens us up to having an experience of God. Opening us up to meet the divine right where we are. If we look at the story, he knew that he could meet God. He didn't doubt that it was possible, that he could go in search of God and find God, and he was determined to set out on the journey, even though he believed it was a long one, an arduous journey, and so he packed up his stuff. And so it's like the master teacher Jesus tells us, you must become as a child. You must become as a child in order to enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, the kingdom of heaven, as we understand it, is not a place that you go when you die. The kingdom of heaven is a consciousness of God, a consciousness of good and truth, a consciousness of unity, a consciousness where we know there is no separation. And so, what I think the story is depicting for us is a willingness that we get to enter into. I've experienced this recently for myself, letting go of all of the things that I think I know about God. All of the things I have learned, all of the things that I know for sure, and all of the things that I believe. Because a belief is just a thought that we keep on thinking. And so are we willing to just enter into that place of not knowing? Because when we think we know and we go in search of something, guess what we're going to find? Exactly what we've decided we're looking for. And so it's a good story about letting go. It's also a good story that reflects what Deborah was talking about setting a very clear intention. He was very intent on meeting God. Jesus also said in the Sermon on the Mount, "Blessed are the pure in spirit, for they shall see God." The pure in spirit, the pure in intention, those who are pure in what their desire is. If we really want to meet God, if we really want to know that divine presence, then we get to open up, let go, be innocent, be curious, be in wonder, and set a very clear intention to know that divine presence. I think that's what that little boy really represents to me in the story. And then he packs up his Twinkies and his Dr. Pepper. Two things, root beer. I would never want either one, but I'm guessing that as a little boy, that was probably some of the things that bring him the greatest pleasure, the greatest delight in his life were Twinkies and root beer. And so he packs those and he takes them on this journey. That's another attitude. Are we going to meet God from a place of, the God of our understanding? We open up and we bring our joy and our delight and our excitement about meeting God, about our interface with this divine, openness, willingness, clear intention, and just the excitement and joy of being open to the divine. And I think that's really, from my perspective, what that represents, at least to me. And why does he stop? Why does he stop not far into his journey to sit on the bench? Again, I think it's because of the consciousness, the intention, the openness, the receptivity to listen for that inner guidance, the intuitive nature, that still small voice, the voice that said to Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. about going up to the mountain, to stop, to listen, and to respond to what that inner guidance is. And so he stops. And he sees this woman. We don't know much about her either. But I like to think that she's just sitting there watching the pigeons, watching the birds. Again, an attitude of openness, an attitude of presence. The master teacher Jesus teaches us about that as well, because you don't know the time, the day or the time, when the dawning of Christ's consciousness will come to you. He talks about it in the story of the virgins waiting for the bridegroom. To be focused, to be open. Eckhart Tolle talks about it in The Power of Now when he tells a story about him sitting for hours just watching the ducks on the pond. Just being present and alert and attentive. Where is that going to show up? We don't know. But we won't know if we're caught up in all of this activity of the mind. It's about being in the moment, and I think that's what she represents. She, in her own way, too, was looking for God. And then the little boy notices that she's hungry, and so he gives her the Twinkie. Now, the Twinkie, to me, I think what I was thinking about earlier was that, Moses was promised this land flowing with milk and honey in Canaan. And I think this little boy was, instead of flowing with milk and honey, he was flowing with root beer and Twinkies. He lived in that land where that was his joy, that was what fed him, that was what nourished him, and I think that's really what that represents. And the Twinkie, to me, is like representing the sweetness of life. The sweetness and the softness of life. And so he took what was precious to him, all that he had in his world, all that he valued, all that was his joy and delight, and he freely offers it to this woman. And she freely and gladly receives it and smiles. And her gratitude and her appreciation are his gift, are his reward for being in the flow of that goodness and sweetness and life. And then he wants to see that again, so he gives her his root beer. And I'll think about root beer. It's not one of my favorite things, but I think about that as, it has a little bit of spice, and it's bubbly. It's like life. It's effervescent, ever expressing, and it has just a little bit of spice. And so he's offering her the experience, not only of the sweetness, but the effervescence and the spiciness of life. And she gladly receives it and accepts it and smiles. And they have that exchange, the openness, receiving and giving and flowing and expressing. And in that exchange, they both meet God. And my question for us today is, how and where do we meet God? Are we open to meeting? Have we set a clear intention? Are we clear about our desire to know the divine, to come into a consciousness of unity and oneness with the divine, to be the expressions of the divine in the world, to give and to give and to receive and to be in the flow of that? As the little boy represented for us the curiosity, the openness, the willingness, and the freedom of giving and the freedom of receiving. So are we clear? Do we know for sure? Do we know for sure that it is possible, and where are we meeting God? I think when we come to life, when we approach life with that attitude of curiosity and wonder and clear intention, and bringing our delight and our joy and our excitement and our enthusiasm and being present to what shows up in our lives, then we meet God in every face we see. We meet God in everything we experience. We meet God in the pigeons. We meet God in the driver next to us on the freeway. We meet God in the mountains. We meet God in the face of every child and every old person. We meet God where we are in consciousness. And it's up to us to choose and to decide it is my opportunity every moment to experience the presence of the divine in everything that I encounter and in everyone I encounter. And then, like the little boy, we go home every day just joyous and excited. Guess what? I had lunch in the park with God today. Or like the old woman who goes in with great peace and says, I ate Twinkies in the park with God today. How are we going to choose today to experience the divine? It's up to us. It truly is.